Well, hey friends, welcome back to another Wednesday night video. As we started last week talking about cities in the ancient world, not just during the time of Jesus, but places of importance in their history and how that influences and affects the people who live there and therefore the experience the people in Scripture. Last week we started with Rome. This week we are going to talk about Jerusalem. Last week I spent way more time recording this video than I intended to. I don't want to listen to me for 30 something minutes talking about ancient Rome, so you really don't want to. So I am going to try and make sure that this one is a little bit shorter. Bit of a challenge because we're talking about Jerusalem this week. You know, maybe the most central city to the text as we have it. So without any further ado, we will go ahead and dive in and start talking about Jerusalem. Jerusalem's history is a little more extensive than that of Rome. Rome, I said, came into being, was settled somewhere around the 8th century. The area where Jerusalem sits, the city of Jerusalem, dates back to around the year 3000 BCE with the Jebusites who lived there. If you look at the person of Melchizedek in the book of Genesis, he is the king of Salem, priest of Salem, and what most language scholars around Hebrew and the Old Testament world will tell you is that very likely that's an early reference to Jerusalem, and gives you some early connection there. Jerusalem is a borrow word. It is not strictly Hebrew, so you get a little bit of the old brought in whenever it becomes the city of David. The story of the capture of the city of Jerusalem is told in, 2 Samuel 5? Double check that I've got that right. Yeah, right after David becomes king of all Israel, he captures Jerusalem. That's like his first act, and then it becomes the city of David. Then it becomes the place where the ark is. Before that, David had been all over the place, but his primary place of operation had been Hebron. Then it becomes Jerusalem, and it's then in right around the 10th century, the 900s, that it becomes a possession of Israel. During the time of David, around the time that he captured Jerusalem the first time, based on archaeological evidence of the size of the city and all of those things in the time period, it's likely that it had maybe as few as 500 people in the city, maybe as large as 1,500. Well-defended area, but not a huge population. But that was pretty par for the course. I mean, you got to remember what type of infrastructure it takes to support a large group of people living in one spot, and Jerusalem is lacking some of those things. It's always been plagued by lack of good access to water. There are, of course, springs in the area, but one of the first things, well, we'll get to that in a minute. I don't want to jump the gun. During the time of David as king, he builds up the population of the city a little bit, but not extensively during David's reign. So those stories of David in Jerusalem, of course, David and Bathsheba, you're still talking about a city with a population of about 2,000 people, which makes the word city weird to use. Which to me, coming from small towns, makes me wonder what the rumor mill, the gossip line was in Jerusalem regarding David and Bathsheba. Figuring it operates like a small town does. What are those whispers like going on during that time period? Of course, David is succeeded by Solomon, and Solomon institutes the building of the temple. Solomon's temple is not a particularly huge space. It occupies some acreage, but it's not anything like what Herod builds, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But because Solomon elevates the importance of Jerusalem, because Solomon brings in workers to build this project, and of course then brings in the infrastructure required to support those workers. During the time of Solomon, Jerusalem becomes a town of about 5,000 people. And then it doesn't show much huge growth in the next couple hundred years. But by the time we get to Hezekiah, Hezekiah does some of the work required to expand the population of the city. And one of the things that he notices is the whole water issue. And so one of his projects that he's best known for, that the Bible mentions when it talks about his reign, is the construction of this tunnel that moves water through what had been solid rock. From what was outside the city in, and it becomes this protected piece. But what he does that nobody before him had done is secure and localize Jerusalem's water supply. And as soon as you have easier access to water, you have a better base for a population to build from. You have a better system of maintaining and supplying that population. Access to water improves things like gardens, which were hand irrigated. But when you can do some stuff like that, then suddenly you provide the platform for population growth. That tunnel that he builds is something like a third of a mile through solid rock. It is not a straight line. It curves its way around, and nobody's really sure why. There are a couple of guesses. One is that they were terrible architects. They couldn't dig a straight line. That seems unlikely, but is certainly possible. That makes it very impressive, however, that they met in the middle. Another thing that is suggested that seems possible is that there was already some sort of natural fissure or weakness of some sort in the rock, and they just followed that. Maybe there was already like a weeping point at the bottom of the rock in Jerusalem that made them think, for whatever reason, that it led to this spring. But no matter, they tunneled through solid rock in an incredibly impressive fashion in order to secure the water supply for Jerusalem, both to grow the population and in case of siege, which turned out to be incredibly important. It was 2 years of nonstop digging to create this 3-foot wide, 5-foot tall, maybe a little taller than that, but not by much, tunnel that secured the water supply. So by the time of Hezekiah's reign, Jerusalem's population has extended. They do some wall work and expand the area inside the walls, and it's likely that the population during Hezekiah reached as high as 20, maybe 25,000 people. And you got to remember, that doesn't sound like a ton to us, but these are ancient cities that we are talking about. Rome, with a population of 1 million people by the first century, is an outlier, and it certainly did not start with that. So at the time of Hezekiah, Rome has been in existence for maybe 100 years, give or take a little bit. So that tells you a little bit, maybe for comparison's sake. Of course, then not terribly long after Hezekiah, 100 years or so, Jerusalem's destroyed and its population reaches near zero. It is utterly ruined, and there would be some people who lived in the ruins afterwards, or some itinerant shepherds moving place to place that may have sheltered there from time to time, but the place is wrecked, and it's no longer the type of place that sustains a large population. So when you read of the rebuilding of Jerusalem by Ezra and Nehemiah during that time period, even their rebuilt Jerusalem is only equal in size to what it had been under Solomon. It's not like they put in the work and in those next few years they build it back to what it was before. It's not. And so when you read of the rededication of the foundation of the temple in, what is that, Ezra 6, Nehemiah 3, I don't remember. You can check those sites and get back to me and let me know which one was correct, or neither. Neither of them may be correct. There's this moment after they rebuild the foundations of the temple where the young priests celebrate and the old priests weep. And I don't believe they're just weeping over the destruction of the temple and how it's not what it was. I think they're looking at the city as a whole, because they've hit this giant reset button. And you can understand how devastating that would be for them, especially if you look at the prophetic words, where that responsibility is very often laid on the shoulders of the priests and the kings, the leaders of the people who led them astray, who did not set a good example, all of the different ways the prophets word that. But again, like before, it starts small, it slowly grows its way back. And those expansions continue to take place. That period of rebuilding starts under the Persians right after they defeat the Babylonians. Cyrus is a way more benevolent leader in the Persian model, way more permissive than the Babylonian model was. And not only do they allow the people to return to their homes, but they even start providing resources for rebuilding. They see value in rebuilding Jerusalem, or allowing the Jewish people to rebuild Jerusalem. And then Alexander the Great comes along, and he defeats the Persians, but they also do significant infrastructure work in the ancient world. And they build roads and systems that allow population movement, that help increase the ease of supply of some of those resources that allow cities to grow bigger. And so by the time you get to the 2nd century BCE, so around 150 years before Jesus, when what's known as the Hasmonean period takes over. That's this period of about 100 years between Alexander the Great and the Romans, when Jerusalem, Israel, experiences independence for about a century. During that period, it slowly works its way back up to about 35,000 people. That is large for Jerusalem. It's large for a city in the ancient world in that time period. Sure, there are plenty that are bigger, but there are loads that are smaller. And then you get to Herod. And Herod the Great becomes king through some rather underhanded dealing, which is probably not the most surprising thing to hear about Herod, but I'm not going to take the time to dive into what that looks like right now, because I'm watching the ticker at the bottom slowly count up. And again, I don't want these videos to be 30-minute monologues. So Herod becomes king. He's declared by the Roman Senate to be king of the Jews, which is, a rather loaded phrase in the New Testament. If you think about what Jesus has declared at the crucifixion. And again, that's intentional. Herod is sent back. And Herod is not Jewish. He's half Jewish. He's from Edom. He becomes the client king of this large territory. And the Jewish people do not like being ruled by a lax non-Jew. That's how they see Herod. And to call his Jewish practicing lax would be the understatement of the century. He's a rather murderous dude who it was once said of that it was better to be Herod's pig than Herod's son, because Herod wouldn't slaughter pigs, wouldn't touch them, but his children he would. So, maybe not the greatest moral example to have on the throne. But what Herod does do in order to curry favor with these people who have made it clear that they don't like him, is essentially to buy them off. Now, he doesn't do it with money, he does it with building projects. And so Herod invests heavily in Jerusalem, and he invests heavily in the temple. Herod doubles the size of the Temple Mount, more than doubles the size of the Temple Mount, actually. It goes from right around a dozen acres to 33 acres, which is, again, an acre is roughly a football field. So you imagine 33 acres, just 33 football fields just run end to end in this big rectangular pattern, and you get the idea of how large the Temple Mount was. Herod was a good Hellenist, and he wanted the temple in Jerusalem to compete with other temples in the ancient world. You've got to remember, he's traveled to Rome. He's seen what life looks like outside of Jerusalem. and he understands what the Roman world values. And so he wants to be able to compete with that. And so he invests heavily in the building project. What we now know as the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall in Jerusalem, that is just a really big retaining wall. I don't know if you knew that or not, but that's what it is. It's a massive retaining wall. And it's the retaining wall that Herod's work crews built in order to then backfill it with all of this dirt that allowed the Temple Mount to become so big. And we don't know exactly what the temple looked like when it was completed. Herod never got to see its completion. It took 46 years from the time the work started until the time the work was finished. It was finished in around the year 26 when Jesus was born in the 4 BC. So around the time Jesus is 30 years old. Just so when Jesus is a boy in the temple, it's still under construction. During Jesus' early ministry with his disciples, that's when it's, being finished up and completed. Jesus and his disciples would have seen this construction, play out. And so when Jesus talks about destroying the temple, of course, this is especially hard for them to hear because it has just been completed. When Jesus' disciples look up and stand in awe of the temple and its majesty, it's because they've watched it be built to this point. So there are these huge Roman columns for Solomon's portico that go around the outside of it. Potentially there was access to the top of the portico and even more structure above that. It's just hard to know. The temple itself, the instructions for what it was to look like and how it was to be constructed don't change much. But the area around it does. So for the 3 major festivals that are in Jerusalem throughout the calendar year in the first century, those were periods of time when the population of Jerusalem would swell massively. So an area built to hold 40,000 people, give or take a couple, becomes a place where up to 250,000 people come. There are no hotel rooms in the ancient world, certainly not to the extent that we think of them as. The closest thing they would have had, what we often call an inn, is more like a bed and breakfast, and there weren't that many. What you hoped for was hospitality. You might have friends or family members who lived there, but people stayed with total strangers. They stayed in their spare rooms. They stayed in their barnyards. A first century home in the Jewish world was often built with a courtyard below and a sleeping area above. So when we talk about Jesus being born in a stable, it's not some cave way out of the city or a barn out behind the house. It's very likely somebody's like downstairs area of their house, but that now is not the time to dive into all of that. Or they stayed in the villages outside of Jerusalem, like Jesus and his disciples do. And they walk a couple of miles in and out, Bethpage and Bethany, and they do that on a regular basis. Or they camp. They camp outside the city. And you want to get there early so you have a better choice of campsite. Because the further away you could be from Gehenna, which was actually a literal trash pit outside of Jerusalem, Jesus uses that as a very nasty visual image for his audience, the better off you could be. But of course, it's not made to hold 250,000 people, so those festivals can't go on and on and on forever. People have made lots of guesses as to the size of Jerusalem during the time of Jesus that are much higher, but the infrastructure, the size of the physical size of Jerusalem simply couldn't support that many people for that long. It's not just a place for the Jewish community. There have always been non-Jewish people living in the land. You've got to remember there were people there when they got there, and they didn't just run them all out. And there are always people coming in and out, of course, with all of the destruction and resettlement that takes place in the 1,000 years from David to Jesus. you have huge population fluctuation. Um, During the period of the Hasmoneans, there are plenty of Jews that are looking forward to what's coming next and come to Jerusalem. There are also plenty who see what's happening, do not regard it as holy, and they leave. And so you end up with huge Jewish populations scattered throughout the ancient world, something we will talk about as we talk about some of these other cities in the ancient world. Now, we do have some Roman record. And just real quick, something needs to be said about reading Roman records. One, prone to exaggeration. And two, written from an outside perspective, if you're talking about Jewish community, anything like that. So in the late 1st century, we have this Roman historian, dude named Tacitus, who's talking about the Jewish rebellion and then Vespasian and his son's military efforts to put that down. Tacitus states that the population of Jerusalem is 600,000 people. Now, that's almost certainly incorrect. There is Roman ego at play here that artificially increases the population. And then there's also the natural population increase that comes because Jerusalem is the center of this rebellious fight against Rome. So yes, there are people who come in to participate in that, but there is simply no way on earth 600,000 people would have lived inside Jerusalem during this time period. It would have been the world's largest game of sardines. They were stacked on each other like cordwood. So it most certainly was larger than 40,000 people during the rebellion. Tacitus also says that the Roman military kills 1.1 million Jews during the rebellion and during the Jewish wars. That is undoubtedly an inflated number. For lots of reasons, not the least of which is as much as there were Jewish people fighting against the Romans, there were plenty who wanted no part of it, and were not interested in sticking around. So between Roman inflation, the artificial numbers inflation, and the people who would have come in to fight even while others fled, 600,000 is just an absurd number. That would have been basically the population of Rome at the same time period, and there's no way on earth that a place so much smaller could have held that many people. Instead, like many places in the world, there are just villages every couple of miles. And so people come in and out and in and out because Jerusalem is very much the center of Jewish life. And so it's a place of importance, certainly a place of significance. But, 40,000 people is a massive city in the ancient world and a shrug, in ours. So I think that's one of those things that's maybe important to remember as we read through Scripture and we think about how places operated in the ancient world. We make a mistake if we assume they operate much in the same way that our world does. It's something as simple as, Lindsay and I's home, which I feel like is a relatively average home around here. 1950s construction, closets that are a little bit too small, is a city block as far as, the average resident of first century Jerusalem is concerned. Not quite, but not far off. And so remembering that as we read some of these stories in Scripture is, I think, important. All right. Jerusalem's story kind of ends in 70 as far as the New Testament is concerned. Anything that we have in the New Testament written after then is talking about a Jerusalem that really no longer exists. There's another attempt at rebellion based in Jerusalem, 132 to 135, the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And after it's destroyed, the Romans have had enough. with this upstart population on the Eastern Mediterranean. And so they basically kick all of the Jews out of Jerusalem, and they build a temple to, I think maybe Jupiter, if I'm remembering correctly, but to Jupiter and to the emperor on the site of the old temple. And after that moment, Jewish domination of the population of Jerusalem doesn't exist anymore. Even in the modern world, Jerusalem is a place where loads of people, Jewish and non-Jewish, live. But that's a whole other conversation for a whole other day. The one thing I would say is that after the destruction of Jerusalem, our New Testament writers cease to refer to, I think, a literal Jerusalem. And here's what I mean by that. When John in Revelation talks about a new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem, one, he has good reason to talk about a new Jerusalem because Jerusalem basically ceases to exist. But two, he is no longer talking about a physical Jerusalem, in my opinion. And I'm not alone in this. There are loads of people who agree with me, and the ones who don't are kind of outliers. Instead, what he is talking about is something that is metaphorical or metaphysical or whatever. It's not about here, which makes perfect sense if you read the New Testament. It's about what God is doing, what God has promised and is doing, and that is beyond some earthly retainer. So I would caution anybody who reads New Testament writing, and especially stuff like Revelation, and starts looking towards physical Jerusalem that exists now as a place of answers or solutions or anything like that. It's simply not about that. And I think this is another one of those moments we're talking about actual Jerusalem in the ancient world. It is simply not, other than a location, it shares nothing with modern Jerusalem. And even then, that's debatable. But, of course, it's a much larger population now. We have infrastructure that supports more people. But that's enough for today. I've gone and done what I said I didn't want to do. And I apologize for that. And so next week when I start the video saying I don't want to spend 30 minutes talking about, what are we going to do next week? Maybe Corinth. Just get ready for me to go 27 minutes and 55 seconds about Corinth. Y'all have a good one. We'll see you next week.